Thank you, Nidhi, and thank you for organizing this and getting us all together. And Ameya, congratulations, taking over the chambers. I was already seeing a lot of vibrancy which you brought to it. And I'm glad that you're getting more and more of these things going because I think things are changing so fast and so much is happening that these kind of conversations are very, very critical. And to have them more frequently always helps. So thank you for doing that. And obviously, Pavel, we are waiting to hear from you, your experience, because that is something which is going to be most interesting and critical for us. What I thought I'll do, and Nidhi, Ameya, and Pavel, if that's okay with you, just to step back a little and to share with you what is happening in India today. There is this tremendous level of unprecedented transformation which is happening. And it's very critical to understand that to be able to see as to why do we are now in a point where we are seeing a large interest globally, every which way, socially, politically, economically, and especially on the side of investments. We're seeing a large number of investments moving into India. And obviously, it's been a part of a larger context too, where I think everybody, I remember when we started Invest India in 2015-16, when the Honorable Prime Minister wanted to create a body to help investors and to handhold them through their entire journey in India. And that was actually his way of saying that it's not a red tape, but it's a red carpet. And that's how Invest India was born. And what I was seeing in the past 6-7 years, especially, is that there has been an interest of people wanting to diversify risk, which is a classic old story of economics and investments. But obviously, sometime in the early 2000s, things got waylaid and there was a lot of concentration going towards certain areas. And everybody suddenly realized that we need to look at a diversification strategy. That was the first part to it. The second element which happened is that everybody wanted to shorten the supply chains. You see, they had become too long, too complicated. As a result of it, there were too many elements involved and the complicity became very difficult. So as a result, they were wanting to shorten the supply chains. And third is they wanted to move them closer to where the market was. And you bring in all these three elements and we'd started seeing a lot of interest coming into India. In fact, we started with a team of 4. Before we hit the pandemic in 2018, 2019, I had a interest book of anywhere about $80 billion. And we had a team at that time of about 110. Suddenly, during the pandemic, it shot up. During those 24 months which we went through, the interest book went up to $230 billion. And I'll tell you what I mean by the interest book. And I had to do 2.5 times of the team. We eventually left. When I left late last year, the team was at 480. So you could see how fast things are going and how fast things are changing. And what I meant by the interest book was that we had a dedicated relationship manager for every investor coming into India. And we knew exactly what their plan was because we were helping them execute it and what would be the quantum of investment over a period of 3 years or 4 years or 5 years, because that's how it planned out. And that is how the order book was happening. So even during what is the worst phase in our lives of all of us together, you had this huge interest of investments coming into India, and everybody, that interest sort of translated and transformed itself very quickly into execution. And everybody wanted to do it. I remember just about 2 weeks ago, there was a Fortune 50 US company, and we had their senior leadership in India, and I was sitting with them. And one of their senior leaders used to be in India as a young executive in 1996-97. And I was asking him, what is the change you have found in India ever since? Because you've been following India very closely, and it's a consumer goods industry. And he said, in the early 2000s, I knew India can. There was a huge potential. Today, we know India will. There is a point of certainty to it. And to the point that they have now invested over $450 million in India, and they're putting up a new product and an R&D center with another $110 million. By the way, just on R&D, let me tell you, in the past 90 months, India has now become the #1 R&D center in the world for global multinationals having their R&D center outside of their home country. So we've close to about 1,600 which have opened in the past 90 months, and that number is increasing. So let me now back up a bit and give you a little background as to what is happening here, which is what is creating this interest, creating this potential, and creating the world's interest and trust into India. By the way, before I end up on that point, we in the past 90 months last year, we touched $1 trillion FDI investment in India ever since our independence. That is 1947. But over 600 of that has come only in the past 90 months. So you can see how fast that is moving. It's come from 162 countries. It's come into 61 sectors. Both is unprecedented. Now let's step back. The first very interesting element in India is how politics is changing. And we have our friends from the US, so very good morning to you. And I know you are getting ready for your 60th election this year. We will be going in for our 18th election of the parliament this year. We have 543 seats to the parliament. And as I was reading this morning, Jonathan, thank you. As I was reading this morning, we have about 64 countries this year going into election. Plus, I'm told that the European Union, in addition to that, this was calculation by the time. So it's a huge election year. But let me tell you what's happening in India. Now that we prepare for the 18th election, sometime towards the end of the first quarter or beginning of the second quarter, this will be the largest ever election in the history of mankind. The 18th election of the Parliament of India, 543 seats. Let me add a little dimension to that. 12% of the world's population will be choosing and electing our leader. 12% of the world's population. We'll have 1 billion people who will be eligible to vote this year for 543 seats. Let me add the multiplicity to that. Of that billion, close to 95 to 100 million will be first-time voters. This is the youth which is now coming in, which are crossing or reach the age where for the first time they will be voting. You have elections every 4 years. We have elections every 5 years. Why I'm giving you the statistic of 95 million? It's very important to see the sway which they can have. Close to 10% of the entire electorate is of a first-time voter, the youth with the same aspirations as anywhere across the globe. This is what is creating a core change in India, this aspiration and this youth. And what they have actually done is they brought good economics as the center of good politics. That has been a big change in the Indian context. And that has been driven to by a very resolute leader. It is that very interesting inflection point in our history, and I will come to that. But let me share with you a little more on when I told you that this is going to be the largest ever election which is happening in India in the history of mankind. 1 billion voters, I've already told you, for 543 seats. We'll have over 1 million polling booths. Currently, of those 543 seats, we will have over 8,000 candidates. Today, we have over 2,600 political parties. India works in 21 official languages. It has a total of about 35 languages, which are used by over 1 million each, million people speakers, and 3,500 dialects. 100,000 publications, close to 1,000 TV channels, of which about 40% are 24/7 dedicated to news. Why am I telling you all this? This is to show you that how freedom, democracy is at the core of the Indian story. And please remember, even when I give you the numbers in my last election, they performed it to a sigma 6x. All the results which came out, very few contests here and there, which always happens in a very lively democracy, but everybody stood by those results. The sanctity of the entire process was maintained. The most complex exercise on the planet, the most complex. And this is what we are getting ready for it now. Now, why do I bring to you this entire political side of it? You see, whenever a country is going through a rapid transformation, and this is what we are going through now, you need that resolute leadership to take it through. We saw that resolute leadership even in probably the most challenging times in our lifetimes for all of us, the pandemic. And you know, when the pandemic started, and I still remember March 2020, when we went into our first lockdown, and there was no playbook for this one. Please remember, it was all there. I remember the Honorable Prime Minister saying his focus was both on life and livelihood. And that is what has held us in good stead. We went into the pandemic as the fastest growing large economy on the planet. We walked out of the pandemic as the largest growing fast economy on the planet. And even during those 20 months, think of it, the world's largest vaccine program was run in India. The world's largest food support program was run in India. 800 million people were given food support right through that pandemic. And not just for ourselves. This country supported more than over 125 countries of the world with vaccines, with medicines, and mind you, with our own set of people. And also, please do not forget that in 2020 March, we became the largest human capital on the planet with 1.4 billion people. The largest human capital. And yet, all this was done to a point where the economic robustness continued to remain. And at the same time, we saved our lives. We had our economy going. It was a tiring time and it was a very trying time. Yet they did it. And I recollect, and Ameya Nidhi, you would also remember it. And Pavel, since you've been closely looking at India, you remember on the 20th of March 2020, we didn't have any PPEs available in India. We had none. We were scouting all across the globe to try and get them, and it was very difficult to get them. The supply chains were broken. People were not exporting it out. They were wanting to keep it all for themselves. And forget ventilators. I'm talking of plain PPEs. But you know what? By July, that is 120 days later, not only had we started creating for ourselves, we were ready to export it for others across the world, exporting them to Europe and other parts of the world. What happened? Our startups got together. Our larger companies got together. And I remember our teams were working very closely on that entire effort. And they came up with very innovative solutions. Not just that, the proliferation of trying to get even test centers. All that started happening. And why am I telling you this? The reason why I'm telling you that is that the entrepreneurship element of India is what is now sparking off the next growth phase of India. What I call is the inflection point of India. Startup India was a new initiative which was started by the Honorable Prime Minister in January 2016. By 6 years later, by about 2021, 22, and have it go through even the pandemic, we just had about 200 odd registered startups in India at that point of time when it was started on January 16, 2016, as I told you. Today, we have over 160,000 registered. India today is number 3 in the world in number of unicorns. It's number 2 in the world in number of startups. It's number 1 in the world with new startups adding every day. And the interesting element about startups is that they are giving us solutions to challenges which we thought were unsurmountable earlier. That is the first element of my startups. They are making things possible. 2, they are making things possible in a far more economic manner. What was called the frugal innovation element of India, the strength of India came onto that one. Just to put it in perspective for you, our mission to Mars was, we got it right and successful in the first attempt itself. And the cost of that mission was 1/10 of that of anybody else, including the one which was sent by the US. It costs less than a Hollywood movie. The ability of India to do it cheaper and to do it right in the first instance is where my startups have started bringing out those solutions. This is what Prime Minister Modi was focusing on. He actually wanted to create, because please remember, 1.4 billion people, and let me show you the demographic on that one. With an average age of 29, India will be the youngest large economy on the planet all the way for the next 50 years. I have 1 billion people under the age of 35. And he also knows that you had to create a system where people were not just seeking jobs, but creating jobs. Because his entire focus of his entire governance has been 1, on inclusion, and 2, in empowerment. If you bring in the strength of 1.4 billion minds, include them into your process of growth, and empower them, see where that growth can take you. And that's exactly what we are beginning to see today. And one of the reasons why that happened is when he launched Digital India in 2015. To my mind, that is one of the biggest critical elements which is shaping India's current status and its future. For the first time in our history, we had each and every individual, each and every citizen of this nation be a part of the growth process, ability to participate in it, and ability to benefit from it. And that's exactly what we started seeing. Even during the pandemic, when the growth continued, we had the ability to reach out to all these people and to maintain their health and to get to them the support stuff. Let me give you another very interesting element. You see, the world's largest water program, it was called the Jal Jeevan Mission. Just to put it in perspective, we have about 200 million households in rural India and about 100 million households in urban India. And each household is roughly about 4 to 4.4 individuals. That means we're looking at about 8 to 900 million individuals in rural India and another 400, 450 in urban India. Of those 200 million households in rural India, and let me give you an example, bear with me for a minute. I just want to show you how fast India is changing. Of those 200 million households, when the pandemic started, we just had about 30 million odd households which had a drinking water tap in their house. Only 30 billion of those 200 million. Now, please remember to fix or to take a drinking water tap, because the Prime Minister said that in the next 5 years, that means by 2024, he wanted each and every house to have a drinking water tap. Now, imagine the complexity of creating that. You have to put in a type, there's water storage, there's water metering, there's water treatment. Every element of it has to be brought in. Pipes have to be laid out. Even in the midst of the most unprecedented lockdown, we added 100 million households with a water tap. That means close to 400 million people in the lockdown today. While you and I were sitting locked out in our own rooms, isolated even from our closest family members, we had the system moving to make the economic element going. And with full precautions. And with vaccinations. That was the strength, and that showed the resilience of India. So you had a resolute leader who's leading towards the aspirations of the youth with his focus on execution and transparency and inclusion and empowerment. You had a society which is totally, you had a nation which is totally trusting him and in their own ability with that resilience to make it happen. And put it both together with a relentless zeal, both of the leader and the country. And that is what is changing India. And now let me just share with you, why are we seeing these large companies now moving into India? Let me give you a quick instance on that, since there was a comparison with China. You know, last year we opened our first Apple stores in India. Very interestingly, the first Apple stores opened in China was around 2007, 2006, when the Chinese per capita income was 2,700 US dollars, or about. Last year when they opened in India, our per capita income was also about 2,700 US dollars. So essentially, if you're looking at it, there is about this 12, 15-year gap between them. But let me now tell you how that gap is closing and how fast India is moving. Let me give you the story of a GDP. It's a very interesting one. And this will be my last point, Nidhi. I know, have I exceeded my time? Do I have 5 minutes?
Yeah, you do have 5 minutes, Deepak.
Okay. I'm sorry, I just get carried away when this happens. But do let me share with you on how this entire digitization, this automation has not only created transparency, but it has also created pace and ability and empowerment. We touched $4 trillion last year. So, 2015, 14, when the Honorable Prime Minister took over in 2014, we were number 11 in GDP in the world. Today, as you know, we are number 5, moving on to number 4. With our 4 trillion, we are the 4th largest. So we're probably the only country in the world which has moved up in about 100 months from number 11 to number 4 and 5. We moved ahead of Russia, Italy, Brazil, France, UK. UK, when we touched 4 trillion. The first trillion happened in 2007. That is from 2047 to 2007. We are talking about 60 years. The second trillion happened around 2013-14, which is about another 8, 9 years. The third trillion happened in 2020, which is 5, 6 years. The fourth trillion happened in just about 36 to 40 months. Now, why am I telling you this? One, you're seeing how fast these things are changing. At this pace, as I am looking at it, our eighth, ninth, 10th, and 11th trillion each will happen in about 12 to 18 months each. This happened in China. If you look at it from 2009-10 to 2016-17, they added a trillion every year. How does it create that inflection point? The reason is, in the past, when I moved from 3 trillion to 4 trillion, which took me 7 years, I moved 135 million people above the poverty line or out of poverty. So 1 trillion, 135 million moved out. Just imagine how fast that change is going to start happening now. And if we continue on this growth, when we touch 100 years, which is on 15th August 2047, not too far away, we are looking at least, and I know whenever there's an inflection point, so the economists will give you figures of anywhere between 30 to 35 trillion, because, for them, or the future for all of us, is a state of some exponential or some growth from the present, or of our reading of the present. My point on inflection points is, which is what I was telling you about my 8th, 9th, 10th trillion when they come about, is that things speeds up immensely. And that pace is what I'm talking of. And what we are looking at is that now in the next 9,000 days, if I look at how my states are growing already, and if I look at the average growth rate of the states of India, we have 28 states and 8 special territories. I've just done a very rough calculation on that one. I'm just looking at the average growth of my states from 2014 to 2019. This is my last point, Nidhi, so I'm just taking 2 minutes on that one. 22 of my states have grown at an average rate of over 10% per annum, 22. If I just extrapolate that, it takes me to 42 trillion only of those 22 states, and the balance 14 have been growing at an average of 8 to 10%, which takes me to 9 trillion. We are already looking at somewhere around $50 trillion on 15th August 2047, when India turns 100. Let me leave you with the last point which I have. On that day, the global GDP is expected to be about 200 to 230 trillion or 250 trillion. That means India's share in the global GDP would be anywhere between 20 to 25% of the global GDP. It's the same as what India's share in global GDP was in 1750, the Wheel of Fortune. 21% of the world's workforce will be in India. 20% of the world's middle class will be in India. And close to 20% of the world's population will be in India. And India, even at that time, will be one of the youngest democracies on the planet. You look at that milestone itself, and you see why businesses are coming here. And I've not touched on the point on how the entire transformation of the investor journey, which is happening in India under the leadership of the Honorable Prime Minister, is where he has digitized it completely. He's transforming it to complete transparency and pace, so that business in India is not just viable, as he says, business in India should be profitable. And India should be the trusted partner of the world. Thank you, Nidhi. Thank you, Amaya.